Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf, and as you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, looking for new technologies to reduce the damage caused by wildfires. Not to put out all the fires, because some of them are actually good. I've got Dr. Kate Kapalo with us today. And you know, I love researching like all things fire and wildfire. And so I comb through LinkedIn extensively looking for, who's doing something interesting, who's got something going on I didn't know about. And I ran across Kate, and it says in her description here, human-centered R&D for fire and emergency services. So my first thought is, what the heck is that? And I thought, who better to tell us than Dr. Kate herself? Welcome to the show, Kate. How are you?
I'm doing
That's
really
your
well.
cue to
Thank you
say,
so
I'm
much.
doing good, Steve.
I'm doing really good. I appreciate you having me. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, absolutely. So what is human-centered R&D for fire and emergency services? Since
That's an
that's the
excellent
moniker you're
question.
flying right now.
Absolutely. So, in a nutshell, my background is in human computer interaction. So, that's kind of a blend between human factor psychology and computer science. So, when we talk about human centered design, the idea is instead of designing technology where we kind of make assumptions about what the user should be doing, I actually go out and I put my money where my mouth is in terms of supporting the fire service. So, everything that I do, I'm technology agnostic, I'm a researcher. So it's not necessarily endorsing one system, but the idea is that I am pulling requirements from the users themselves instead of just kind of designing technology. If you build it, they will come kind of mind frame.
Right.
So when you think about human factors and what it means to center a human in systems for emergency response, the idea is I'm factoring in all of the different things that go into that. So, stress, fatigue, all of the things that you're facing, whether you're boots on the ground or incident command, all of those things go into your process, your mindset, your cognitive psychology. And so, what I do as a researcher is I factor all of that in to better understand how can we design technology that provides you the right information at the right time.
Very, very interesting. Right. This is kind of the way I feel about my stuff at home and my stuff in my car. Right. It ain't what you got; it's what you got with you. And
Right.
right. And so we see, in my opinion, a tremendous amount of capacity for data overload right now. Right. That everyone
Exactly.
thinks, oh, if I give these incident commanders more data about this, more satellite views from that, more position of the troops and the fire this and the whatever, like that they could make better decisions. But as we're finding out, sometimes that actually has an opposite effect.
Absolutely. And that's one of the big challenges too, right? It's based on not only your role, but what information we're providing you, at what cadence are you getting that information? How much
Okay.
time do you have to react? How much time do you have in between decisions? So, in wildland and wildfire incidents, the timeline can be a little bit more extended, right? So in theory, people are saying, "Oh, well, if I give you more satellite images, if I give you more information, that should be better, right?" But the quality of information matters. So, what information am I providing to you quality wise? And then also factoring in things like if I'm a type 3 IC and we're transitioning, from initial attack to extended attack, and we've got to communicate all of this information out, sometimes presenting me with tons of information about what's going on isn't necessarily what I need in the moment because I'm busy allocating resources. I'm, trying to factor in all of these things that go into the transition. So getting you the right information that's curated specific to what you need in that moment, that's a big component of it. And then when we look at, why have certain things not been fully adopted in the wildland and wildfire space, one of the challenges is related to the idea of, are we providing you what you need? So, a good example of this would be decision support systems. A lot of times in the wildfire space, we're seeing that they're used more for documenting decisions that have already happened as opposed to actually supporting your decision making to
Interesting.
anticipate conditions. And so those are the kinds of questions that I try to answer in my research. I try to leverage that. My background, I actually started with the Navy and studying F-18 Top Gun pilots and how they make decisions and their after action review processes. And so I try to adopt that and think about that process in the emergency response space because I think there's a lot of parallels between obviously obviously we have aviation and wildland and wildfire, but also just coming from the how are you making decisions in the moment? How does that impact you as a person who has no time to decide what's going to happen next? You've just kind of got to go with your training and what you know you feel in your gut.
So that's an interesting differentiation with regard to the time frame, right? That if it's a single incident, shoot, don't shoot,
Right.
limit the data and focus it on the criticals. But when you have a fire campaign that's going on for weeks or months, you have a lot more time to explore the data. And thank you for your service. Um, were you
Thank
were
you.
you inspired towards working with the Air Force as a result of the volleyball scenes in Top Gun?
That's a great question. No, so I was just a civilian research psychologist, but I was very intrigued by the idea that in human factors, when we think about the limitations of human decision making and how we've always kind of thought of these different models, the computing models of cognition, those kinds of processes, as much as we want humans to be computers, they're just not. And so
No.
thinking about after action reviews, line of duty deaths, unfortunately, that's a huge part of my job. I actually got into this because I I participated in an internship that had a simulated wildfire and earthquake at the same time.
Oh,
I was at the
wow.
Naval Postgraduate School and I fell in love with emergency response. And unfortunately, the reality of California is not far off from both of those things happening simultaneously. And so I think from there, it just kind of dawned on me that human factors is a huge component of what we do. It's been a huge component in wildland for a long time, but the idea is that we have a lot of lessons learned from parallel domains that we can use to approach our work. And that's what I try to keep at the forefront of everything I do is this idea that when we center the user, when we think about their needs versus just, what are the needs of technology vendors, what are the needs of people working in this space, we tend to have better results just based on the idea that this is designed for you, kind of by you, sort of thing.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and in terms of the directionality of causation, I hope that they've concluded that earthquakes can cause wildfires, but wildfires are not likely to cause earthquakes.
Absolutely. We in that internship actually it was really interesting because it's called the Joint Interagency Field Experimentation Project. And so what that means is essentially we had vendors go out to a field and test their technology in an austere environment. So if you don't
Okay.
have perfect lab equipment, if you don't have perfect networks, if you don't have perfect connectivity, how does your technology function? And it was really interesting watching that happen. One of the things that really comes out of that process too is this idea that we have ad hoc groups and kind of organic vendor relationships that grow out of that. And so this person's like, well, I have the solution for this and we have the solution for this. So let's partner together and talk more about it. And that was really interesting to watch and witness as an intern because once you're in that space, you kind of fall in love with the idea that we can make technology better. We really do have powerful opportunities and it doesn't have to be users against vendors or this kind of animosity that grows. We can all collaborate together and make this work for everybody.
There's enough fire for everybody.
Yes.
Right. I brought the
Absolutely.
chocolate. You brought the peanut butter. Right. And make something work. So it looks like there's really no field of data where your influence wouldn't have a positive impact in the emergency space, right? Because there's a
Yeah,
lot of players coming out with. Go ahead.
no, that's okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say there's like a lot of players coming on the field right now with data solutions, and one or two of them might have an idea that more is not necessarily better, and the timing of the data is essential. And can I give the person, like you said, what they want when they need it? Um, so, how are you interacting with vendors who are creating software, data, AI solutions to bring to the emergency space?
That's a great question.
And do they all
So
know about you? And are they all reaching out to you with generous contracts?
Uh, unfortunately not. No. So what I do is I try to, a lot of my work again is in the R&D space, so it is pretty technology agnostic. I'm answering some basic questions. So that doesn't mean that I don't support vendors. If vendors come to me and they say, hey, I have this idea and we're interested in looking at the UX or UI of this, I definitely support that. But I did do a postdoc at Brown and jointly appointed at NIST in their public safety communications research division. And there I led a lot of projects related to how we can use virtual and augmented reality, create test beds. So a lot of the solutions that I look at are we grounding this in actual real life incidents? Are we pulling requirements from interviews? Where are we getting our data and how are we making our assumptions about what we're doing? And then the scenarios that we build, are these built on, things that are evidence based in terms of has this happened in the past? What were the outcomes? What decisions did people make? We look at all of that holistically. And then I would say, to give you a more specific example, a lot of my background has been on pre-incident planning. So I do a lot of work in the hazmat and structural space. I recently delved into the wildland space out of a need. I have a huge passion to support the wildland community, but it was one of those things where that hadn't been my background in the past. And so what I looked at was pre-planning and how we can use human performance, human factors measures to better understand the pre-planning process. Can we capture baseline metrics? So a lot of what I do is kind of focus on this idea that we have these assumptions about how these tools help firefighters, but we didn't necessarily collect data or have lots of studies that back that up. So I kind of lead the way in terms of how do we measure situation awareness what as it relates to pre-incident planning. How do we look at cognitive load in the moment? If I give you a scenario and you're using a pre-plan, can I measure objectively what's going on? Are you accurate in your information? Are you able to remember where certain things are? Those kinds of questions. And that way we can design interfaces that have more evidence-based solutions and provide those recommendations to vendors, I guess. So it's a two-way process. I'm building that evidence base up, but I'm also looking to vendors for their feedback and solutions and what's worked for them and their clients, and kind of how we can all create this ecosystem that works and makes technology better for emergency and fire services.
So in this pre-planning space, what would be your reply to, let's say, a World War II quote? Plans mean nothing, but planning means everything.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So when we think about pre-planning, obviously the best laid plans are always something that you can't, there will always be an outcome that you can't anticipate or something changes. But if you fail to plan, you're really putting yourself in a poor position. And so I'll give you an example from the structural space. When we look at, as the incident's unfolding and there's outcomes, being familiar with your first do area is really important because it can save you time, it can make your tactics more effective, and we're collecting data on this idea that it actually can improve your performance. And when we look at, how things have played out in certain incidents, one of the challenges is not knowing the structure, not having familiarity with that. And you can't always, memorize every single corner, nook, and cranny of everything. But if you have a better picture, if you have a better layout, if you have a better plan that's accessible from the beginning, then you can formulate a little bit of a more structured plan, and you can kind of create those backup plans on backup plans and have an idea for what's going to happen versus just letting everything unfold and putting all that cognitive load on yourself to figure it out in the moment. And so that's really the kind of approach that I use in my work, is focusing on how can we reduce that cognitive load, and pre-planning is one piece of that. It's not everything, but it is one piece.
So what if we could eliminate the need to reduce the cognitive load by taking the weak link out of the system? People. If we had, right, if we had robots that could put out fires, and
Right.
there was they could process an unlimited amount of data and continually reformulate their optimal suppression plan. Better, worse? What are we losing in the process there, if anything? Or are we just getting fires put out and firefighters not being either cognitively overloaded or thermally overloaded?
Yeah, so I will never be someone that advocates for replacing humans entirely because I don't think that firefighting as a system could work without humans at all. That's just my own personal opinion, and I know, there's definitely ways that we could use and leverage systems.
I mean, I
I
talked to a
think the
robot the other day and he had the exact opposite feeling.
city. Absolutely. They want to take over the world, right? No, I think we have an advantage where we're talking about AI more than we ever have before. I think there
Yep,
are a lot of good things that AI brings to the table. The way that I see AI supporting the fire service and the way that people are currently thinking about this, this isn't just me, this is a bunch of researchers across the nation who are working on this, but AI can reduce your cognitive load by pointing you to anomalies, right? So when we look at ignition or we look at different points in the fire timeline or the fire benchmarks, whatever you want to call it, the idea is we're pointing you to problems that are existing so you can spend less time combing all that information, right? So that's where
right,
systems and AI really excel, is helping you point out anomalies, focusing on the things that you need to focus on, narrowing your attention. And I think those are pieces and parts where I see AI being most useful. I don't know that we could completely eliminate humans from the system just because there's a lot of cons to that as well.
sure.
But yeah, I I
So I
think
guess
that's
the
one.
the real question is, can we take humans out of the most dangerous parts of firefighting, the places where maybe a robot is more uh, readily sacrificed, and would that give us additional tactical options, knowing that we could attack from wherever we want and nobody's going to die?
And I think that's an excellent question to ask. I think there are opportunities for us to inject technology in a way that does support that process. The challenge, as it exists now, is that there are a lot of differences, I think, in how we think about different aspects of our attack or resources. So, are we going to have, let's say we had these resources available across the entire country and it's not regional specific. Thinking about that, how we would implement robots into the timeline. This is actually what I did for my master's
Oh,
work.
wow.
So I focus on how do we perceive robots for the Army, essentially. How human like do they need to be for us to trust them? Those kinds of questions. And really, what we found is robots tend to function best when we think of them like a partner or a tool or a pet. So they're not necessarily human like, they're not
Right,
functioning at our level, but they are something that is at our disposal. And so when we think about it that way, when you think about the EOD robots that exist now, it's very similar, right? We put them in very dangerous
right.
situations and they're able to do their task, and then they come back and we have an operator and we think about it that way. So I don't think that's far off from how we would perceive it. It's just there's a lot of complicated things that go into we have the ancient fire triangle, right? Like the it's a tetrahedron now, but back in the day we called it the
Thank you.
fire triangle. And
Now that
and
they've added
we have,
chemical reaction,
yes,
I
well,
lobbied for that for 25 years.
absolutely, which I appreciate. No, but we have the idea that there's a socio-technical triangle, right? So there's people at the top, then there's incidents, and there's technology. And without all of those three, and thinking about that process and how each part fits into that framework, we're neglecting one part. So if we only focus on robots or only focus on technology or only focus on our incidents, we're missing like you mentioned, maybe the weakest or strongest link in the fire service.
So, right. So if we, yeah, so it's probably no coincidence that the most popular robot is Spot, and he's modeled after a dog, right?
Right.
Right.
That
And
is,
they're
yes.
using them to do everything, counter personnel, tunnel inspection, all the things that you wouldn't even want to send a real dog to do.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. And there is evidence behind how we think about that process. So you're right. It isn't a coincidence that certain robots are modeled to look like pets. They have pet names. That's where a lot of that evidence came out of. It was this Army funded project to focus on how do we think about the personification or the idea that we're anthropomorphizing robots.
Right. And maybe in some cases, a dragon would be preferable to a dog, right?
A
If
dragon
we
would
need
be
a
cool.
machine that can go out and blow out fires, for instance, then we could think, oh, we have this giant dragon. It can blow back the fire. Or it's like the wolf in the Three Little Pigs, and right, it huffs and it puffs and
Absolutely.
it pushes your fuel supply away, or it disrupts your chemical reaction, or it sneezes and it applies retardants to an area. Uh,
Absolutely. I think your pilots might argue with you about sending a dragon instead of them, but I think they'd be on
what
board
if
with a
they could make
dragon.
the same money and control the dragon on their
That's
joystick
true.
thing,
Yes.
then they like. I mean, we all saw the original evidence of this, right? When we watched The Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And the great Oz was all powerful and yet still chose to take a human form, even though
Absolutely.
it could have been any form of technology.
That's
Um,
a great point.
so, and I don't know that really that Oz had a lot of choice in being human. I think, right, the man behind the curtain gets to decide what he looks like, but
That's
puts him
true.
into a form that people could relate to. And I
Exactly.
think that uh, robotic firefighting technology, it will be it'll have to be something we could relate to, but I think it's going to be driven by form factor, for functionality, rather
Right.
than by how cute is it or how mighty does it look. Uh,
Absolutely.
does it
That's a
look
great
like
point.
something that came out of Terminator? Right. So,
Hopefully not.
but functionally, that wouldn't be wrong. Right. In the open scene of
Right.
Terminator, there's these hunter killer robots, and their job is to stomp around and find humans and remove them from the equation.
Right.
So we could think of a fire killer robot that's job is to walk around the forest and find fires and uh, terminate them with extreme prejudice. So I think we could see that, and that could be a great ally. It's not going to replace people, but it could be a great
No,
adjunct, and it could certainly be life saving.
absolutely.
Especially if you think of it like a really cool remote control toy rather than an autonomous thing off making decisions by itself that you're not influencing.
Right.
Um,
And I think that's the key to that, to making that successful, is that it isn't just an autonomous entity operating in its own system. There are people monitoring it. There are, feeds that are coming back to incident command. It's not in a bubble doing its own thing. It's actually supporting fire service operations, fire ground operations, and we're not sending this robot to go do as it pleases, as it wishes, without any human intervention at all.
right. It has to know what our priorities are, what our assets are,
Exactly.
and what the conditions
Exactly.
are. And those are really
Right.
the way I see it. The three things: what's happening, what have you got at your disposal to do something about it, and what is it that you're trying to do. And
Exactly.
right now, we tend to think of the role of data in there as just to inform the human, and then the human has to come up with a plan. And
Right.
what I'm wondering is, are we going to see data coming up with a plan, and then a human can sign off on it? Because um, if you were to think of a megafire as a 100,000 acre chessboard, and the fire has megawatts of heat and so much fuel and wind and all these things on its side of the board, and then here's your incident command team on the other side with their planes and their helicopters and their shovels and picks and rakes and toothbrushes and sack lunches and everything else, right? What's the ideal way to employ these people against that force based on what your objectives are? So a computer doesn't know whether it's more important to save the Dollar General store or the nuclear power plant, right? You have to tell it, like, hey, this
Right.
is a utility, and if it burns, that's going to be bad for everybody, even for you, Mr. Computer, because your power's going to go down, right? So, um, and the computer doesn't know what you have until it queries a computer-aided dispatch system to find out what resources are available. But once it does that, I would think it would be really helpful in formulating a response plan, not just informing
Absolutely.
people so that they have to come up with the plan.
That's a great point. I think there's there have been strides to make that happen, and I think there's a lot of good technology that is supporting that direction now out there. Um, to your point, I think it makes sense. What we know from decision support system literature is that idea that here are multiple courses of action. These are all the things that you could potentially do. Choose which one makes the most sense given your tactical priorities and what you believe should be the incident action plan. And I think once we get to a point where technology can recommend things as opposed to saying this is 100% the direction that you're moving in, I think that's where we're starting to see a lot of the information overload problems kind of come to a head too, right? Because there are challenges related to here's information, make a decision. You're absolutely right, but I think also putting the onus. We have to be careful, I guess, in how we're presenting those courses of action. And so that's one area that's really important in user experience research and human computer interaction is looking at how am I presenting those recommended courses of action to you and what does that look like? And am I doing it in such a way that helps you further what you're trying to do versus make it so challenging for you to decide which direction to move in based on whatever information I'm curating in the moment. And that's where it comes back to the, design of algorithms and what biases are we putting into this, and are we making sure that we're thinking through all of the repercussions of what these different courses of action would mean. To your point, will this take down the nuclear power plant or the Dollar General? Are there people in the buildings? All of the occupancy questions,
There's
all of
nobody in
that.
the Dollar General because no, there's only at most there's one employee.
Right. Yeah, that's a trolley problem. I don't know if we can if we can
Right.
go down that boat right now, but
Right.
yeah, I think you're bringing up some really interesting questions that we really need to push ourselves hard to think about, especially because, AI is a very valuable tool. It is a really great thing that has, challenged us and pushed us farther, but it is a double-edged sword, and so we have to be very cautious in how we implement and think about these kinds of recommender systems or decision support tools.
Yeah, and that whole area of science is so new that we really don't know how it's going to play out. But
Right.
if let's say we thought of the AI not as a pet, but as an amazing high level executive assistant, you don't want your what do they call executive? Your EA? Is that what I see on people's resume now?
Think so. EA,
EA. Well,
or
okay.
sometimes
So
it's
let's say
virtual
you have a
assistant.
top
Yeah.
level right assistant. Like you don't want them to say, hey boss, here's this is happening and this is happening and this is happening and this is happening. What do you want to do about it? Okay, well I could have found that stuff out myself if right? So what you want that person to do is say, "Hey, here's these, six scenarios that are unfolding, and I've done some research, and here's how I propose that we deal with it. We fire this person, we reprimand that person, we promote this person, and we move this other person to Japan, and then everybody's happy, and we get the best possible outcome, and then the admin, the exec or the IC gets to say." Sounds great. Thanks for thinking that through. Go ahead and do it. Right. And then you
Right.
still have that, person signing off at the top. But the fact that the solution has kind of been thought through or gamed out, I think really makes the process a lot easier.
Absolutely. And
That's what
I,
we're
I think
hoping.
that, yeah, definitely. And I think that's where that conversation about transparency in AI comes through, because when we talk about some of these algorithms, people don't necessarily know what's going into them. Even some of the people designing them don't always understand how it's going to unfold and work. And so that idea of the black box, we need to make that black box not a black box. It needs to be transparent. And we need to know how AI or how this recommender system is making decisions. And so to your point, in the executive assistant example, if they can say, well, I reasoned it out this way, I did my research, and these are the things that I'm basing these premises on, or the idea that I've made this decision based on what I know from these different pieces of sources of information, that's where we want to go. We don't want to go to a place where it's like, here's a recommended course of action, and I have absolutely no idea how it came up with that. So that's I guess another component of that is like, how much overload are we putting on people to make sure that we're vetting what the recommender systems are telling us and saying. That's another key component of that. And when we think about ethical research, especially in the wildland and wildfire space, like, this is human life. This is not something that we can get wrong. And so that's one of those core things where it's important for everyone all around in AI, but it's especially important in this field.
Well, we do get it wrong already, and people do die without the help of AI, right?
Right.
Sometimes humans just make the wrong decision. And what if we were to
That's
flip
true.
that question that you asked of the AI, show me your transparency, show me your work? If we were to flip that back on incident teams, we'd say, well, how did you come up with this decision? What's your research? What's the algorithm going on between your ears that led you to this conclusion? And we might see that a lot of it is, prejudicial based on that person's experiences. Right? What fires have they been on? What fires have their team been on? What have they seen? But that means that they're going to be basing their future actions on their past experiences. And what it looks like to me we're seeing in fire is that what's coming towards us has very little in common with what we're coming from. Right? That the nature of fire, the ferocity, the speed, the intensity, the frequency, and the destruction are a whole new ball game now, in the last 5 years. And so coming to, as a human, to solve that problem with the biases of how things were, yesteryear, like, really might not give optimal outcomes.
I think that's an excellent point that you bring up. I think it also factors into, we're promoting people faster than ever before because of that. We need to train people faster. When we think about, what you've seen in a 30-year career in the wildland space, you're right. It has changed significantly. We are seeing a lot of differences in what you've done in the past and what's coming in the future. And so I think there is a lot of I guess barriers, challenges
Mm-hmm.
to making this
Yeah.
work. But at the same time, if we don't start to think about these things, we're already too far behind. And you're right, we will not be at a point where we can save lives if we're thinking about this too late in the game. So I think this is an optimal point in time where we say, what has worked tools in the past? What can we learn from that? And then how are we going to apply those lessons learned in the future? And you're absolutely right in the sense that, this is unprecedented. So maybe borrowing from your past isn't necessarily the best practice, but that's where we can leverage technology and say, okay, well, in the past, you might have gotten this incomplete piece of information given the limitations of the tools that we have. Now we have AI, and we can show you with these cameras exactly where the anomaly is. And that's where we're pointing you to, and you can make better tactical decisions based on the idea that we now know where the problems are. And that's something that we haven't had in the past. And I think that's something that we're going to have to think about how we're integrating into the ecosystem of fighting fire. But it's really important to focus on that and to say, okay, well, where are the tools that we can leverage, and how do they augment human cognition? How do they support that process?
That's a really excellent point, because AI gives us the beginning of a glimpse into learning about what we don't know, right?
Right.
If you don't know what you don't know, it's really hard to formulate a great plan with that. So at least being
Exactly.
aware of what you don't know, and then giving computers an opportunity to maybe fill in some of those blanks is helpful. You know, you use the word unprecedented, um, and first, I don't know that these fires are unprecedented because I haven't been around for a couple 100 million years. So we may have had fires like this, sweep the globe many times previously. But what's not unprecedented is the rules of physics. And physics drive these fires, right? It's chemistry and
Right.
physics, right? It's fuel, oxygen, heat, chemical reaction, fire. More fuel, more oxygen, more heat, more fire. So maybe the bottom line of the equation of how much fire we're getting is bigger. But if we ask the fire to show its work, the the underlying empirical formulas of how it got to be such a big fire are not new, right? It was just
Right.
more of a fuel load, more of a wind supply, etc. So ideally, one would think if the chemistry and the physics of fire hasn't changed, then the suppression strategies would correlate to them very closely. Just the bottom numbers are just bigger than they used to be.
So I think there's a lot to unpack with that. And I agree with you that maybe unprecedented isn't necessarily, I don't know that I framed it correctly, but what I meant by
Well,
that is
no,
the idea
you
is,
framed it the way it's commonly framed, and I'm
right.
just,
Well,
you know,
yeah, no, that makes sense. I think what I mean by unprecedented is what we talked about. Like it's unprecedented from a training perspective. It's unprecedented from how we're talking about we're teaching how teaching incident commanders how to deal with these fires, how to manage these, how to do their tactics. And so I think from a training perspective, you're absolutely right. The physics is there, it's been there. And maybe these fires have ravaged the planet before, but this is a period of time where we are seeing a lot of challenges related to recruitment, retention, staffing. So when we break this all down, as much as it is a physics problem related to wildfire, there are a lot of socio-technical problems that go into thinking about this. And so as we're battling these fires, I think the challenge that we really have to keep in mind is we are facing some limitations, maybe not in the way that we conceptualize them in terms of, you know, like as you mentioned, more fuel load, it makes more sense to fire. But I think one of the challenges is how do we teach type threes? How do we teach local battalion chiefs? How do we teach everyone to manage that process? Because based on the timelines that we have now, there's not a lot of time to be able to teach them this before the next fire season. So how do we pack all of that training and knowledge into their training pipeline to better support them? And I think that's one way we can do it. Another way is potentially technology too, augmenting where they might not need training because we have technology that can provide recommendations or decisions, and they just need to be trained on that technology. So I guess there's a couple facets to that to unpack there.
yeah. And when you talked about the need to get them trained, and have an operational plan ready to go before the next fire season, tell them relax. There'll be another fire season coming next year. Right?
Yes,
If you
unfortunately.
survive this one, you'll make it to the next one.
Right, absolutely.
But it's yeah. So um, this I'm going to share personal bias with you. Uh, there's nothing against the. I mean, you're an original creative thinker. My fear about education in some regards is that if we're teaching everybody the same thing, then everybody comes up with the same answer. And if that answer doesn't work, where's the left field answer going to come from that does work? Right? Like if every engineer knows how to solve problems the same way, and those solutions aren't working, then we need someone with a different thought process to come in and shake that up a little bit. And where does that fit into the fire service and the way training is done? Because because what worked before isn't working now, and so
Sure.
the way we trained people to work before, you know, might be sending them into harm's way more than helping.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're seeing a lot of changes. So I think there's a lot of groups out there doing good work in this space. And so one of the things that I'll bring up as an example, because you're right, there are some challenges with training everyone to the same level, but at the same time, we're not teaching them how to think, right? We're training you to deal with fire behavior. And so
Yes.
that's one of the pieces that underpin this is the idea that I'm not necessarily training you exactly what to do. I'm training you, this is how fire behaves. So this is how you respond to it in this situation. situation. A good example of this is the International Association of Firefighters. They're leading a training class called Responding to Interface. And it's essentially a class designed to help local battalion chiefs, local company officers, anyone who's first on scene in incident command who doesn't necessarily have tons of wildland experience, how to respond to WUI incidents. So from the time that you get the call to arriving on scene, they're teaching you wildland tactics. And this is for structural people who really aren't familiar with the wildland space. And I think that's a perfect example of how we're looking at, okay, I'm going to teach you the physics and the underlying processes about how fire behavior works. This is how fire works in this situation. This is what a WUI incident entails. And then now I'm going to teach you these are the things that you can pull from your toolbox to respond. And, that's just one way of thinking about, I'm not telling you this is exactly how you have to do it every time, but I'm giving you some tools in your process or in your toolbox so that when this incident does happen, you know what's going to be effective, what you can do and what you can pull from. And then, you can call in your resources when you become, saturated to a point where it's like, this is outside the span of my control. I can't do this anymore. Then you know what to do in that situation. You call for help. But I think that's one example of how we would do that without necessarily forcing, everybody to think the same way, because fire behaves differently given different conditions, and we can't say like every time this is exactly how you'd respond to it.
Right. That would be dangerous. Right. So
Right.
you're kind of separating out the buckets. Like, this is the shoot, don't shoot scenario. And when you're on the street, you're going to have to figure that out because we can't tell
Right.
you. But this is how the gun works. And we know everything about that. And these are what the
Exactly.
ballistics do. And we know everything about that. So
Right.
here's how this tool works. Here's what it does. Here's what it's good at. But you're going to have to figure out whether it's the right tool for the job based on the data you're getting about a particular fire and the fire conditions.
Right. And that's where that piece might evolve. Like as we have better technology, we might change the way that we think about fire behavior. So I'm not saying like everything we do today is 100% the way it should be done or how we should train everyone, but I think just giving you that option to say here's the fire conditions, here's what we know about fire behavior, what would be effective. So it's more like training your thought process as opposed to telling you the answer.
Okay. So right now your title based on your academic achievement, kudos, is doctor. If
Yes.
we were to trade in the doctor title for the czar title and we made you the fire czar, how would you lead the country or well, why the country? If you're the czar of fire, that could be the whole planet. How would you provide the leadership for informing the world how to deal with the destructive nature of wildfires? So we've just promoted you. You're in charge of all fire services globally. What's going to change? What are we going to see coming out of your office?
That's a tall order. So
It is, but you know what?
it,
No one else has stepped up to take that position, that hold that office yet. So
absolutely.
based on what you say, you might be the candidate.
Yeah,
No
I
pressure.
mean, that's a lot of pressure. I will say though, I think focusing on the human, actually, the unpopular piece of this, it's at the center of everything that we do. And I'm obviously biased because I come from this world, and
And
human
you are
factors is
human.
really, yes, I am a human. I'm not a robot, despite what people might think. But I think one of those pieces is that idea that training is really important, making sure that everybody has the background knowledge that they need to be successful. That is one piece of this. So I think training is a huge component. That's something that I think we would want to expand upon. Not saying it's not great in its current form, but and then I also think what at least for the US, this isn't necessarily true globally, but there's a lot of challenges surrounding pay, fair working conditions, making sure that firefighters are protected from occupational exposures. One of my big passion projects is looking at wildland cancer incidences and how we can
Huge.
better protect them. And that is a huge piece of this that we just don't know a lot about right now. We're seeing those new studies coming out with the Aaron Brockovich chemical related to wild. So we don't even understand all of the threats out there. So I think one of the pieces of this is how do we make sure that our workforce is protected? How do we make sure that they have what they need to be successful? And then once we secure those basic things, we could do a better job. And in other areas, globally, like Sweden and Greece, there's a lot of opportunity because there's a ton of papers coming out every day where they're talking about different forms of decision tools, how we're thinking about taxonomies, how we can better design algorithms to provide information at the right time. So I think it's going to be a combination of all those things. Going back to, maybe it's not a fair answer, but my crappy triangle. I think that's if we focus on that framework and we dissect some of those pieces and parts, that's what I would want to see change, is looking at not only how do these different sections work alone, but how do they also work in tandem? Because you can't have a healthy workforce if you're not providing them with the tools they need to be successful.
Well, that also opens a whole
It
list of things to
does.
unpack,
It does.
including that like robots never asked for more pay, health care, or a parking place, or more time off. Um, but the reality in the world is that that fire is a human workforce, and so we have to work first with what is before we can start fixing what could be. Um,
Right.
so that's
Well,
interesting. But
and oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say where you were, where it sounded like you were going with this is really that the answer is communication platforms where the information that you generate, that your teams generate, is shared. That these things are being shared internationally. That really everyone on the planet who has anything to say about fire at some point comes on the fire break, so we can learn about what they think, and then
I would love that.
y'all talk amongst yourselves, right?
That's
But I
true.
think the
Yeah.
dialogue, right? The dialogue is really, where the thing. Even if you were the fire czar, you'd still let other people have their say, even
I
if you
think
didn't
that's
act on what they told you.
I but that's a huge part of this. I don't think any one of us can be the expert. And so when we think about interdisciplinarity, and how that relates to fire problems, you can't go into this approaching it from one lens because it's such a complicated, I don't want to say mess, but it kind of really is, right? We've put
Yeah,
ourselves in this position where we can't solve this from one lens. And so if we're not factoring in a bunch of different voices and perspectives, we're not really considering all of the facets of the problem. And I know I'm just a small piece of the puzzle. I'm definitely not the fire czar, but if I had the opportunity to bring in experts that could talk about these different areas that they are able to provide recommendations on, that would be absolutely something we should do. And I think we're seeing some of that happen, at various conferences and at the federal level as well. But it is something that it is something that I think goes back to the idea that we do need to keep our workforce healthy. We need to focus on them, for as long as this is, our humans fighting fires. They deserve attention and time, and focus on that. And I mean, if we could get to a point where we could have a completely robot controlled workforce, then maybe those problems would go away. But I still think there'll be some challenges that pop
well,
up for
yeah.
us.
I mean, part of looking at fire as a labor problem is, in my mind, like saying that we don't have electricity because we don't have enough coal miners. Maybe coal's not the way, and maybe mining it by hand is not the way. And we sure have a lot less black lung now that mining is automated and that we're moving towards cleaner power sources. So I think, a big rethink is not inappropriate for how we deal with this, especially right now, when we're getting wind that this is going to be a way bigger problem, in the next decade or two, right? With the UN estimating, wildfire increasing by 30% by 2050. Now's a really great time to be where you are thinking about this, because while it's only occasionally on some people's mind, the fact that it's 100% on some people's mind at this point is, I think, really helpful. So thank
Yeah,
you.
that's a Thank you. No, I think you're bringing up some really good points and some, there is a lot of it's a complex problem. I don't know, like
Yeah.
there's no one problem, there's no one person that can solve this or else we would have already solved it, right? And I think a lot of the things there are lessons we can learn from the military, if we had an entirely robot workforce, I'm sure they'd give us the blueprint to figure that out.
Yeah.
But until then, we've got to figure it out from the fire service side of things. And there are a lot of thought leaders in this space who are doing incredible work. So, I mean, I'm grateful to them. I'm grateful to you for having this conversation. I think being able to have this dialogue is one step in the right direction.
I hope it does something.
It
Uh,
will. It does.
yeah. And I'm not sure I agree with the premise that if one person could have thought of the solution, we wouldn't still have the problem. If I think back to Thomas Edison, like, yeah, that one guy did all the work. He did the 1100 experiments. He figured out how to make the light bulb. And we all have light today because of it. And so it's not necessarily the case that everyone has to know how to solve the problem. As long as one individual or organization comes up with something that works for everyone's circumstance. So we'll see how that plays out. But the flip side of that would be, NASA putting a man on the moon. Well, no one person at NASA figured out how to get, people onto the moon, right? But what they did provide was the organizational framework that allowed for the input of thousands of engineers, contractors, manufacturers, vendors to all contribute, towards accomplishing that one goal. And in that context, the challenge is really an organizational one rather than a knowledge one, because I have some faith in humanity that collectively we already have enough information to solve this problem. We just don't have enough interconnected sharing of that information. And, you've worked with universities. I'm sure you had to attend a university or two to get your PhD. And one of the things I see is, the amount of wisdom, knowledge, data that is siloed within each research facility. And
Yeah.
this will be my last question for you, because I know you've got dinner to get to. Um, how would you recommend going about unsiloing the data so that whether it's AI tools or humans, we have access to all the information so that we can start to compile a plan that can address all of the circumstances and manifestations that fire takes?
That's an excellent question. And I think it's a hard one to answer because there are a lot of challenges that, as you mentioned, there are a lot of silos that exist, not just in universities, but in government agencies, across industry, even. Um, if in a perfect world, if I could just wave my magic wand and say, hey, the data is unsiloed, I think we would
Dr. Kate's
have
magic fire wand.
right? That'd be super cool. I think there would be, to your point, some organizational framework in place that allows us to unsilo that data. So maybe not necessarily a governing agency, but an agency that provides a platform where we could do all of that work without having those challenges. I think one of the things to keep in mind as we focus on all of this is that Wildland is very regionally focused, right? That's why we have GACs. It's why we have our FEMA regions are divided out because we have different hazards in different areas. And so I think there is some strength in focusing on what's important in your area and what the challenges and resources that you have are. But to your point, being able to share that data across and being able to unlock that interoperability problem, that's a huge key component to that. And if we could do that, I mean, we'd be unstoppable. But
Let's
um,
do that, Kate.
Oh,
Let's do
I'm
that
I'm
because
all for
because
it.
we
Let me know how I can
blame
help.
we blame the first thing I saw coming out of the big fire in Hawaii. Oh, invasive grasses. Okay, well those grasses didn't get there the day before. They
Right.
came from somewhere else. They landed there. They grew. Now they have their green card. They live there legally. They're growing, and wherever those grasses came from, those people knew what its burn characteristics were. So if that data was not shared, Like, hey, I don't know how this grass got here. Really? That grass has been growing in this other country for 7,000 years. They know how to put it out, or they know what its flammability properties are. Again, not sharing the data. Um, what I would like to see is that we give an AI system access to all the data, to unsilo it, to learn from all of the data generated by every fire that we have data about. And then, regardless of what the circumstances were, that AI would have access to knowledge about those conditions. It would know how olive trees burn, and it would know how, the saguaro cactus burn, and right, and then you just tell it, here's the vegetation, here's what's going on, and it would say, oh, here's everything I've learned about that. Boom, like wildfire GPT, so to speak, which which I'm calling deep red.
Deep
Um,
red.
yeah, but I think if we could get that knowledge unsiloed, and then let it serve as a training basis for an AI tool, that's not a tool I'd mind having.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's the piece to also unlock, right, too, is wildfires are so complicated with conditions, with how things operate when you're factoring in fuels, topography, weather, all of that. That is
Yeah.
something that kind of gets beyond one person's capacity very quickly if you have to know all those things. You can't be an expert in everything across wildfire in every situation. So to your point, the idea of leveraging AI to provide that information at the right time, that's really cool because we're getting to a point where we can say, okay, here's what you need to know about this. And then you can use what you do best, tactically or however makes sense to be able to function in that environment, even when you have a lot of unknown unknowns. So that's a pretty cool way to tackle that problem.
Well, yeah, it is. I appreciate that insight. You have gotten yourself into a position where you can be of tremendous assistance through a lot of hard work, I'm sure, learning, hours of studying and writing papers and all the things that you had to do to get where you are. Um, so the last thing, along the way, as you struggle to achieve where you are now, is there one person who was an amazing mentor to you that took you under their wing, their wing, and said, Kate, I'm going to show you the ropes. I'm going to show you how to get where you want to go.
That's an excellent question. I think there's quite a few. I would say there's not one single person that I think like I would attribute a lot of this to, but I would say collectively, the fire service as a whole has been super welcoming, and I'm very appreciative of that. I think I started my career, my fire service career, when I started working for the Navy, and I think that that piece is really important to factor in because had I not had those chiefs give me the opportunity to work for fire departments or do my ride-alongs, I don't think I'd be able to be where I am. So I guess um, there are definitely people I would think. I don't want to get into too long of a list, but Orange County
Okay.
Fire Rescue in Florida has been a really big proponent of that. I would say, obviously I've had some academic mentors who have really contributed to that. So I'm very grateful for them.
Super. I just like to close with that because none of us got where we are by ourselves. We got where we are because of opportunities that other people, helped us to realize or gave us encouragement you know,
Absolutely.
when we were thinking, oh my God, this is just too hard.
It's true.
And then,
I think it takes a village sometimes. It does. I would say like at each point in my career, I had different people who definitely lend me the hand to step up. And I think that's where you really get that. Yeah.
yeah. And I look
That
forward
insight
not
and
only to
knowledge.
seeing, the work that comes out of your head and your efforts, but also to see what comes out of the students that you've mentored along because hopefully, they're going to stand on your shoulders and advance the cause to the next generation. I don't think we're going to solve this in one generation. So whatever we're learning, we got to pass it forward.
Absolutely. My students impress me all the time. They're so much smarter than me. So I'm really excited to see what they do because they are awesome. They do great work.
Wonderful. Kate, if anyone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach you?
That's an excellent question. So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect
Okay,
with me on
LinkedIn.
there. And
Kate
then also,
Kapalo, PhD.
yes. And then also my email is listed on my LinkedIn. I'm pretty responsive to email. It's our bread and butter, so I'm happy to respond to emails as well.
Great. Kate, I cannot thank you enough for joining me here on the Fire Break. Thank you so much for coming in with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Keep up the good work there. All right, folks, you have spent another hour here with us at the Fire Break. I hope you enjoyed it. I thought it was fascinating hearing what Kate has to say, Dr. Kate, excuse me, and she earned that title. The Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire. We're developing new techniques and technologies for mitigating the most devastating effects of wildfire. Thanks so much for joining me, and we'll see you next time. Take care.